Hello, everyone. My name is Kai Hui. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Geographical Sciences at the University of Maryland. My presentation today is entitled A Window of Opportunities of Sustainable Recovery Pathways in Post-COVID in the United States. The COVID pandemic has been a calamity that brought acute threats to the public health, severely disrupted the supply chains and social orders. To contain the widespread of the virus, the majority of people have been practicing the social distancing and changing their behaviors. Policies during the pandemic, such as school closures, lockdowns, have affected people's income, attitudes, values, beliefs, which in turn have affected individuals' preferences and decision-making process, and therefore the way people move, eat, learn, exercise, work, operate, etc. These dramatic and unprecedented changes in economic activity driven by behavior changes have in turn affected global greenhouse gas emissions. The various of emissions, including greenhouse gas emissions, were seen sharply decreases in the beginning of the pandemic due to the decreased consumption. When we talk about recovery, the framing is inevitably in terms of rejoining the previous path. However, we know that overall the previous path was unsustainable, and returning it would not address the pressing need to prevent the dangerous climate change. Instead of recovering to the old path, can we take a renewed path or recover it better? And there is a new normal. While people anticipate the emission reduction is temporary and the economic will recover to the pre-pandemic normal, the underlying this approach is a belief that the disruption is mostly driven by economic constraints and reduced income. In the economic recoveries and as the economic recoveries and unemployment rate falls, it is anticipated that the consumers return to their previous habits. However, the pandemic and the containment policies have impacted more than just economic indicators, but also people's awareness of public health risks and consumption behaviors, even their perceptions of, for example, the climate change or the environment. Now, there are some immediate response to the pandemic, like the lockdowns, stockpiling, for example, some in-person appointment cancellation. These changes are more likely to be temporary. However, some behavior changes during the recovery stage tend to last for a relatively longer time. And one of the most substantial impact is switching from physical transportation, which is a transportation of people and products, to the digital transportation, like the transportation of information, like the national-wide practice of the teleworking, online education, and like virtual meetings, like what we are doing right now. And another is a consumption reduction. On the one hand, people followed everything at home logic. They do everything at home. And people, on the other hand, people also sacrifice certain excessive needs. For example, people may cancel their luxury trip with a flight, for example, in Las Vegas, but in turn, they may take the bike to go to the nearby natural areas. And while not all behavior changes can bring environmental benefits, while some research have shown that the overall emission has decreased, but not all behavior changes can bring environmental benefits. Some even deteriorate the environment. More people, for example, buying cars, which may create a lock-in effect that may causes people to use the cars more in the future. And behavior changes is insufficiently analyzing the current high-level mainstream modeling of the climate mitigation pathways. such as integrated assessment models, which usually assumes static responses to various socioeconomic changes. This simplification may cancel out the individual variation in a stable economy. However, when extreme events occur, such as a pandemic, people may substantially change their behaviors directly or indirectly in response to the perceived risks at both spatial and temporal scales. So these effects may scale up from individual level to the national level, even international level, and may persist at a longer time. In addition, social culture and psychological factors also add complexity to the behavior changes, like people's values, norms, and beliefs are changing, and also the dynamic hierarchies of needs, for example, are documented in, for example, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, a triangle needs. These needs are less quantified by the current literature. And so sustainable consumption also depends on the policy guidance. The response to the pandemic offers an opportunity to investigate the environmental effects of the major changes in the way we live and behave. When people's behaviors are plastic, like affected by the pandemic, policy guidance becomes even more important to shape people's sustainable consumption behaviors. The research objective is to simulate the emission mitigation pathways from behavior changes during the pandemic and explore the sustainable consumption opportunities. The novelties of this research is it developed a framework that depicts how dynamic needs affect the behavior changes and in turn cause environmental impacts. It provides a quantitative description and narratives of effects of behavior changes, develops scenarios from behavior changes to explore the sustainable consumption opportunities. So here is a framework we built to quantify the carbon footprint from behavior changes. While the people's activities are represented by the aim vector, they are driven by different levels of needs, which we use N to represent it. For example, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and these activities are altered and selected by external interventions such as policies, economic constraints, and cultural factors. The activities executed by people are embodied in the physical consumption, like C. We use C here, which cause environmental impacts along the supply chains. So here we map from the needs to activities to consumptions and then environmental implications. For the first part, from needs to activities, we use a matrix on the top of the map to translate people's different levels of needs to activities. It's essentially a scoring process. For example, people now value their safety to prevent from contracting the virus more important. Then they will give a high score of the safety needs. And eventually they will choose to adopt wearing a mask. And from now on, we describe the process of pathway simulation depicted in the red box of our mapping. So we use the Leontief demand-driven open input-out model, which is initially originated and created by Leontief. And then there are some modifications which are developed by, for example, Woods and some other scholars. And this model can capture the direct and indirect effects of consumption along the supply chains. And the more details can be found in the literatures. So here we basically use the F to represent the carbon footprints of the consumption of the I consumption attached to a behavior. And this carbon footprint is a sum of the direct emissions and indirect emissions. For the indirect emissions, we use multi-regional input-out model to capture this effect. And for the consumer behavior changes, we broadly classify the consumer behavior consumption into 6 domains: the food, housing, transportation, goods, services, and work. We grouped the different behavior into 4 groups based on how we use a model, how we modify the model into the activities with replacement between sectors, within sectors, activities with a partial or out of market replacement, and activities without replacement. So we may have to skip some model development and parameter modification for the pathway simulation given the time limitations. Well, this model is also based on a few assumptions. For example, when more people adopt to do the working from home, the teleworking, and after a few years, it may move to a remote area with a spacious, more large house, and it may cause more emissions. So this kind of effect is out of our research scope. So here's a case study to quantify the carbon footprints of a basket of behavior changes in post-COVID. So here is a scenario setting. We selected 5 major frequently occurring behavior changes and their substitutes in response to the pandemic, and investigate their potential in reducing carbon footprints. And this basket of behavior changes is a subset of the total behavior changes in economic recovery stage following the COVID outbreak. So we use it as only a case study to investigate the greenhouse gas emission pathways from a combination of behavior changes. And these frequently occurring behaviors can achieve aggregated effects by repetitions, and are more likely to have long-term effects. For example, the dining, full service restaurant, going to gyms, commuting with public transportation, private cars, and leisure trips by flights and ferries. And then we have a couple of substitutes in case people cannot do this during the pandemic. So we have a share of behavior substitution adoption is the initial penetration parameters. There are several parameters for the scenario settings. So here's the simulation results. We developed 3 scenarios for a basket of behavior changes in the economic recovery stage of the COVID pandemic. Scenario 1 is a COVID stagnancy scenario. So more people tend to keep having their behaviors which they developed during the pandemic. The scenario 2 is a back to normal scenario with minor policy nudges. And scenario 3 is a social diving scenario. So there are different levels of penetration rate and the parameters for the different scenarios. And the path will appear in a natural log shape. So the results show that the selected basket of behavior changes drove emission reduction of about 90 megaton CO2 equivalent at the initial pandemic shock, approximately 1.1% of the national household greenhouse gas emissions. The behavior changes caused by the pandemic, for example, during the first scenario, if this scenario persists, there is a 46 to 62 megaton CO2 equivalent emission reduction can be achieved. However, there is also an overshooting scenario like scenario 3 suggested that the household consumption rebound can also happen. The rebound effect can potentially increase greenhouse gas emissions by 4 to 20 megaton CO2 equivalent to this kind of emissions. And we also simulate the greenhouse gas emissions based on the low carbon options and carbon intensive options, which are shown in the scenario 4 and scenario 5, respectively. So we can know the which options is more sustainable, which is low carbon, and we quantify the different options. What if people adopt low carbon options? What if people adopt the high carbon options in this scenario. And we develop a framework of linking and quantifying people's behavior changes and estimating the aggregated effects of the carbon footprints from behavior changes, as well as simulated the greenhouse gas emission pathways associated with a basket of behavior changes during the pandemic as a case study. The framework facilitates the translation from people's hierarchical needs to carbon footprint impacts, with a case analysis to simulate pathways under different scenarios of behavior changes we developed. And the future work should pay more attention to capturing and quantifying the interactions between consumption and socioeconomic factors, while analyzing the interlinkage between these factors and human behaviors are labor-intensive with high uncertainties. Context-specific results are still needed to fully understand this complicated issue. There are emerging studies using meta-analysis to summarize results from case studies, which could draw general results to inform at the national level effects. And the agent-based modeling is also increasingly used to simulate the process of the consumer decision-making process. While another is equally important to systematically translate consumption level to environment indicators, which could inform both the individuals and policymakers of the environmental impacts of the specific behavior, so they would be informed to choose some low carbon options. So currently, I'll say life cycle analysis and the carbon footprint accounting, which we use in this study by the IO modeling, is by far the most used approach, but it is very important to translate from the behavior changes to consumption to the environmental impact, so to better inform both the individuals and the policymakers. This is like an environmental modeling parts, which may need future work to improve the accuracy in the future. And thank you for your attention.